So despite its advantages, there are many disadvantages of the minimum wage. And that's why the government has slowly moved towards enterprise bargaining. So in this video, we're going to look at the disadvantages of minimum wage. Now, there are two major disadvantages in the minimum wage that we're going to look at. Firstly, the occurrence of unemployment. And secondly, how it worsens our CAD. Okay, so first we're going to look at this idea of unemployment that arises due to the minimum wage. And this is usually due to natural or structural unemployment. Okay, so like any other supply and demand graph, the labor market again has a supply and has its demand. So instead of having the price here in the y-axis, we're just going to call this the wage. And instead of calling this the quantity, we're going to denote it the quantity of labor at any given wage. So as we know, as the wage increases, there will be more workers likely to enter the market. So the upward sloping supply curve is the supply of labor. And again, when the wages decrease, we can see that firms would demand fewer labor resources because it cuts into their cost of production. And so that would be the demand for labor. So in a perfectly unregulated market by the government, this would see the equilibrium price or the equilibrium wage at WE and the quantity of labor at, let's just call it labor E, equilibrium, E for equilibrium. However, if we have a minimum wage, which is often a price floor above the equilibrium wage of labor at WE, the minimum wage will see that there will be a surplus in supply, or a glut. So as we can see using this graph, we will see that here is the quantity of labor demanded by firms, and here would be the quantity of labor supplied by people, by the labor force. So if we look at the example, just a simple example or a numeric example to illustrate this, say that at equilibrium there are 100 people working, there are 100 people at $100 for a $100 wage. Now let's assume the minimum wage increases to $200, and now the quantity demanded of labor by firms is 50, because they can't afford to demand anymore, because that would in fact cut into their production costs and therefore make them uncompetitive or unprofitable. However, there will be now 200 people willing to supply their labor at this minimum wage of $200. So as what we can see here is that unemployment will rise by 50, so those 50 people who would have had jobs at a $100 a week minimum wage would now have no job. So unemployment equals 50 people who now don't have the job, and now again 100 more people who have actually entered the workforce, and now that they don't have a job. So those people could have been learning, they could have been at school, they could have been at university, they could have been studying to develop more skills to enter the workforce. But now, such that the minimum wage has increased, they have more incentive to not study, they have more incentive to enter the workforce, and that would A, decrease our productive capacity in the long run, and B, create unemployment in the short run. So as we know, we live in an economy where we have very few skilled workers, we have a skilled labour shortage, and if the minimum wage is so high, this may discourage people from actually entering university or enrolling in a course, and therefore develop skills or qualifications required to improve our skill capacity, which may cut in or impede on our overall aggregate supply. So aggregate supply is worsened in the long run. And as a result, we have unemployment here of being 150 people. So where 100 people originally had a reasonable standard of living at $100, now 50 people are in fact unemployed. And although these 50 people here are in fact enjoying a very high standard of living at $200, it exacerbates the problem perhaps of an equitable distribution of income, because it actually creates a situation where we have structural unemployment. Secondly, we can see how an increase in the wage would worsen our CAD, and this is usually referred to as our structural CAD. It is due to the concept that our supply is not, or our production is not competitive. And this stems from the fact that our labor costs are high. So as we know, if we're selling a good for, say, good A for $100, country B is selling it for $100 as well, then we remain relatively competitive. However, if we break down the cost of this $100, we have profit. Let's call this $20 worth of profit here. Then we have $50 worth of labor, and then we have equipment worth, or variable costs worth of, say, $30. And so as a result, that's the makeup of the $100 worth of charge. We have $80 worth of inputs here, and we have $20 worth of profit. However, if we were to actually increase our labor costs from $50 to, say, $70, then we can see production, or profit, in fact, would, if they were to charge still at $100, profit would be $0. The labor cost actually increases $20 to $70, and therefore what we have left, equipment costs, stays the same at $30. Still $100, but we're making no profit. So what the business does is, because they're profit maximizing, they're going to pass on the cost to consumers. And so they want to maintain this $20 margin. They're not going to charge $100, they're going to charge $120. And the cause, or the consequence of this, is that we become internationally uncompetitive, because people could purchase the same product, or a substitute product, for $100 by importing it. No longer can compete with international firms by charging $120. So as a result, firms will tend to close down, and consequently this would actually exacerbate natural unemployment, or structural unemployment, yet again. But again, it worsens our CAD because we can't export as much. Exports are less than imports, and therefore our CAD is worsened, and therefore our external stability is again worsened. So a minimum wage could in fact exacerbate unemployment here, and it can also worsen our CAD, which would then impact our external stability. So they're the disadvantages of a minimum wage, and sometimes, although minimum wage may be beneficial in promoting equity, it does in fact have many other disadvantages, and as we shall see, why an enterprise bargaining system is more effective in promoting the economic goals.